So the early days, challenges and hopes. So your father, having identified this place next to St. Peter's Chapel as being an ideal expression of a Christian community, what were the first steps and what was the reaction of people around to what your father was trying to achieve here?
Well, the most obvious challenge was the physical location, and being given permission by the local farmer to have a field. In fact, he wouldn't let us have a field, but he said if Norman got his pals to drain the marsh, they could have that field. And they did. He was very fortunate in that the Bishop of Chelmsford at that time, a man called Henry Chelmsford, said, because he had to have permission to use the chapel at all, said take enough rope to hang yourself. Whereas he could have been stopped because the chapel obviously belongs to the diocese, but he was given permission to use the chapel, which was pretty fundamental to the place. So then, of course, the other thing was financial. It was lucky that there were a lot of ex-army tents, huts and other things around, which he gathered together with his friends and bought and eventually put up. But the physical challenges of that were quite tremendous. There was no water on this field. It all came from the chapel, had to be pulled in carts and buckets, so the water was all cold. And of course financially this was a lot of our household things, blankets and everything came down here every season. So there were the physical challenges. Financially he wanted to keep it as cheap as possible so that no one was prevented by cost in coming. There really at that time was only one car, and that was our old Austin 10. Another physical challenge was the way into the field, which now we come down a properly made road. Then we had to go 1.5 miles along the bank by the seawall, and very often cars had to be pushed out by posses of people because they got stuck in the mud, literally had to be pushed out. So the physical challenges were huge. People didn't mind being in dormitories in those days because they were used to bunking up in air raid shelters and in the underground. So nobody complained about that. Every season a big pit had to be dug for the old Elsham toilet. So it was rough. It was rough and it was hard and it was cold.
What's your first memory, your own personal memory of Othona?
Oh, I think being in a bell tent listening to the rain coming down. On the whole, families were in bell tents because the youngsters and single people went in the Nissen hut, so being in a bell tent listening to rain, sitting in the big dining hut. We had oil and tilly lamps. And my earliest memory, I think, was being in the chapel, which then had an earth floor, because I was 3 at the time, and sitting on the earth floor, probably making small holes in it and looking at snails and things. And the magic of just having candlelight in there, which was very special even as a 3-year-old. And if I'm honest, being bored because I was the only child sometime and all these very earnest adults working and talking hard and being a bit bored. Later on, of course, lots of other children came, that was fine. But in the early days, there tended to be just me and a lot of grown-ups.
So when did Othona really begin to attract a wide range of the generations?
Probably in the 50s, when my father moved to Manor Park. And he would bring his parishioners, his youth groups. And people then, of course, were glad to get away from London and go anywhere. So we got, and a man called Howard Johnson also would bring his youth groups from his parish. So there were a lot of young people who were lively and keen, and because my father had so many contacts, we got some remarkable adults, grown-ups coming down too. Charles Raven from Cambridge, Sir Henry Fitzmaurice, who was an ambassador, and the old Bishop Lloyd of St Albans. So there was a wonderful mixture of the spivs who came down thinking they were coming to Butlins and wanted to get back when they saw it, but couldn't because there was no transport, and once they got into it stayed and became terribly important in building huts and things. And I think then, I suppose if I'm honest, they were really magic times. There were lots of kids around and we spent ages playing in the pillbox and walking over the marshes, which children don't seem to do now.
Was there a real sense of being pioneers? That this was something that was quite exceptional? Yes,
I think there was. And indeed, because ecumenism hadn't really taken hold in those times, we would get Russian Orthodox, we'd get German Lutherans, we got some, as I said earlier, from the theatre workshops, we got the odd communist, lots of free church people, and of course all the Anglicans from Dad's parish and many others. So there were, and a lot of people looking back said it was the first place that they came in contact not just with Christianity as a day-to-day, twice a day in the chapel experience, but with classical music, with great art. We used to get slideshows from an art historian, and it really opened the much wider culture to many people who wouldn't have come across that before because it's long before television. Because they weren't the regular Anglican services. We did have one communion service a week, usually taken by my father or whichever priest was here, and the Thursday dedication service, which was slightly more formal, but the rest were taken by anybody who was happy to take a chapel service. So it might have been a Quaker silence, it might have been the Russian Orthodox singing some of their music, it may have been somebody strumming their guitar, it may have been what I call an Anglican hymn and prayer sandwich with Bible readings. So there's tremendous variety, and every service was quite different, people bringing what was meaningful and important to them, which of course spoke to other people who hadn't ever been in a church. Of course, more in those days had been in churches and were more conversant with how church services were, but there was a tremendous variety of chapel service.